chapter 14. 2 Samuel 14. We began this chapter last week. Is it on now? Now it's on. Okay. We began this chapter a week before last, chapter 14, and we made it through verse 11. Now, the context of chapter 14 is Joab. He desires to make things right. He's looking at the king, and he's seeing that the king's heart is inclined toward Absalom, and he wants to get back with his son. And so Joab, in an effort to help David bring healing to him and to the family, he devised a plan. And Joab, the plan was devious, but his strategy was essentially the same as the strategy that Nathan used. Same kind of idea is what Joab did. So he hired this woman to come in, and Joab gave her the story. Verse 4, now when the woman of Tekoa spoke to the king, she fell on her face. So Joab has instructed her on what to say, and she's agreed to it, and she goes in verse 4 and gives her little speech, her little acting job here. She accepts the assignment, and then she does this and is evidently very convincing in what she does. Verses 8 through 11, the king said to the woman, "Go to your house, I will give orders concerning you." And then you've noticed through here that she continues to speak. It's not enough what the king says. She continues to say more. So just as Joab had hoped, David ruled that the son's life was to be spared. What she did was she made up a story. She made up a story that's going to parallel David's life and his relationship with Absalom. They're going to be parallel. And what she's going to do, of course, is when David is enraptured by the story and he responds to the injustice that potentially might be done, she, in effect, does what Nathan does, says, "Ha." And she'll start that in verse 12. She'll start to say, okay, here's the real deal here. And David is going to be smart enough to recognize that her story parallels his relationship with his son. And it's going to capture David's attention, and David is going to respond in a way that's positive to the whole thing. So David ruled that his son's life was to be, or that the son's life, this made-up story, the son's life was to be spared. And Joab had hoped that he would do that, and of course he did. And David assured the woman that he would issue an order. He does that in verse 8, in her behalf, granting a reprieve for her son. So the woman apparently expressed concerns that the king's disregard for the letter of the law might not let the king and his throne be perceived as being without guilt. And so you see, "Go to your house, I will give orders concerning you." She says something else. "O my lord the king, the iniquity on me is on me and my house, but the king and his throne are guiltless." David understood exactly what she said. So he says to her, "Whoever speaks to you, bring him to me, and he will not touch you anymore." And then she says in verse 11, "Please let the king remember the Lord your God, so that the avenger of blood will not come to destroy, otherwise they will destroy my son." And so she's asking him, please promise on the Lord your God's name. Please remember, say something, make an oath is what she's saying. And remember a couple of weeks ago in Matthew 5:33 through 37, we talked about that little section on oath. It's best not to take an oath. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. The Old Testament doesn't promote them, doesn't discourage them. It says, if you do this, then you need to be sure and fulfill it. Well, she drove David to a point where he says in the last part of verse 11, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." And when David says that, she's got him. She's gotten him to the point exactly where she wants him. Exactly where Joab desires him to be. So, verse 12 through 17, this is where we pick up the story. Then the woman said, "Please let your maidservant speak a word to my lord the king." And he said, "Speak." The woman said, "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God?" So this is the point where Nathan said, "Ha, you're the man." Uriah had his wife, and she was precious to him, and yet you took his wife to him. You have all of these things, and you are not content with what God gave you. So she's got him at the same point that Nathan had David. "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in speaking this word, the king is as one who is guilty, and that the king does not bring back his banished one. For we will surely die, and are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Yet God does not take away life, but plans ways so that the banished one will not be cast off from him. Now, the reason I have come to speak this word to my lord the king is that the people have made me afraid. So your maidservant said, 'Let me now speak to the king. Perhaps the king will perform the request of his maidservant. For the king will hear and deliver his maidservant from the hand of the man who would destroy both me and my son from the inheritance of God.' Then your maidservant said, 'Please let the word of my lord the king be comforting. For as the angel of God, so is my lord the king to discern good and evil. And may the Lord God be with you.'" Now David at this point recognizes somebody's behind this story. And in verse 18 he says, "I want you to tell me, I'm going to ask you something, you tell me the truth. Is Joab behind this?" He recognizes this, and of course she says, As the Lord lives, yes, my Lord, Joab is behind all of this. So David, verses 12 through 17, David had settled the legal matter to his own satisfaction and expected the woman to depart. I mean, it's over, leave. But the woman violated the courtly protocol by requesting to speak a word to the Lord my king. In other words, I want to add something to what has already been said. That's what she's doing. In spite of her disregard for court procedure, David graciously permitted her to speak. So in a lengthy, it's 93 words in the Hebrew, in a lengthy speech that followed, the woman of Tekoa revealed the central thesis of her presentation before David. And the parallels are like this. The thesis is this: what David wanted to do to the people of Israel was practically the same thing as the killing of her, Israel, by the remaining son killing of her remaining son by the vengeful relative. In other words, threatening the future of the kingdom. So it's like this: what David, the avenger of blood in the story, wanted to do to the people of Israel, the woman, was practically the same thing as the killing of her of her remaining son by the vengeful relative. That's the parallels that she's making there. In other words, they're threatening the future of the kingdom by not allowing his son, Absalom, or in the story, her son, to return so that he can someday succeed David as king. David is going against the interest of the Israelite people, and that's her case. And she does it quite well. Therefore, keeping Absalom in exile threatened the fledgling dynasty of David, and thus a continuing quality of leadership for Israel. And so once again, David pronounced sentence on himself without realizing it. He pronounced sentence on himself when Nathan came to him. Nathan gave him the story. David stood up in anger. How dare that one take the one thing that the other man has? He should repay 7 times. And that's when Nathan said, "You're the man." She, in effect, has done the same thing. And for the second time, David condemned himself, pronounced sentence upon himself without realizing it. Speaking as a wise one of Israel, the woman then contrasted two profound truths about life. First, she noted that death is a hallmark of the human condition, and her emphatic verbal statement that we must surely die, there in verse 14, appears to be an allusion to Genesis 2:17, which says we must, for we will die if you eat this fruit. If that is the case that she's doing here, where she's making this allusion to Genesis 2, if that's the case, then she's restating the law teaching that God consigned all people to die. And second, she noted that although God requires every person's death, He does not try to take away life. Instead, He devises ways so that the banished one, the banished person, may not remain in that condition. Verse 14, we will all surely die and are like spilled water on the ground which cannot be gathered up. Yet God does not take away life, but plans ways so that the banished one will not be cut off from Him. That's what she's doing. And this irony here, that God would establish a world system that requires death, but then works to contravene His own system by creating ways to spare life, provided David with a theological justification for becoming reconciled to Absalom. In other words, David thought, because of what you did, you deserve to stay banished. But because God has, within this system, created ways to spare life, gave David the opportunity, and evidently David saw it, gave him the opportunity and the reason to not leave him in that condition, but bring him home again. Since the Lord makes judgments against sinners, and must do so, because He is holy and we are not, but then He establishes mechanisms for reconciliation. So the king, as the Lord's representative in matters of justice on earth, should do the same. That's her appeal. Pretty ingenious, Joab was, in putting this together. The woman confessed that her presentation to the king came from a heart filled with both fear and hope. The people, verse 15, made her afraid, perhaps because of their because of their pessimism regarding her chances for succeeding in doing this before David. But David had given her hope that he might do what his servant asked and would deliver his maidservant from the hand of men who would destroy both me and my son from the inheritance of God, the land that God gave to His people. That's what we see in verse 16. So the woman's, verses 18 through 20, the woman's not so subtle parallels of her tragic story with David's own personal tragedy convinced the king that she was acting in collaboration with a member of the royal family. There were too many parallels. David sensed too many parallels. This sounds all too familiar here. So what does he say? Verse 18. The king answered and said to the woman, "Please do not hide anything from me that I'm about to ask you." And she said, "Let my lord please ask. Please speak." So he said, "Is the hand of Joab with you in all this?" And she replied, "As your soul lives, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything that my lord the king has spoken. Indeed, it was your servant Joab who commanded me, and it was he who put all these words in the mouth of your maidservant." She better say that. She better respond with, "Wow, you are really wise to figure this out. In order to change the appearance of things, your servant Joab has done this thing. But my Lord is wise. Let the wisdom of the angel of God, like the wisdom of the angel of God, to know all that is in the earth." So that her not so subtle parallels of her tragic story with David's own tragedy convinced the king that she was acting in collaboration with someone else. And frankly, it was so crafty that the king could not fail to see what she really meant. What David wanted to know is whether it was Joab who prompted the woman to come to him with the shrewd plea for the return of Absalom. Accordingly, he demanded that she reveal whether it or not it was Joab. Did Joab put you up to this? Essentially is what she's asking. Knowing that to turn to the right or to the left in her answer could prove fatal, she confessed the king always hits the right point in everything, that it was David's servant Joab who instructed her to do this, who put all the words into her mouth. So her response is very carefully worded as well, not to go too far one direction or the other. Though it was true that Joab had arranged the woman's performance and plea, his guiding purpose in it was simply to change and improve the appearance of things, as it says in verse 20. So verse 21 and 22, the king said to Joab, "Behold, now I will surely do this thing. Go therefore, bring back the young man Absalom." Joab fell on his face to the ground, prostrated himself, and blessed the king. Then Joab said, "Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, O my lord, the king, and that the king has performed the request of his servant. So be it," is the effect. "Very well, I grant this." And the demonstrative pronoun, this, I grant this refers to the whole idea of bringing back Absalom from exile. So Joab's plan worked. The question is here is, did Joab know that Absalom was not going to be king? David knew this. We know that David knew this. He knows this already. He knows this as this is happening. He knows Absalom is not going to be king. He knows that Solomon is going to be king. 1 Chronicles 22, I think it is. I think it's 1 Chronicles 22, chapter 12. Chapter 12 of 2 Samuel, verse 24. David comforted his wife Bathsheba, went into her and lay with her, and she gave birth to a son, and he named him Solomon. Now the Lord loved Solomon and sent word through Nathan the prophet, and he named him Jedediah for the Lord's sake. 1 Chronicles, I think it's 22. David already knew Solomon was going to be the one that would follow him on the throne. Question is, did Joab know this? It sounds as though Joab did not know this. He put this woman up to this. It's seemingly for the whole purpose of strengthening the family, of strengthening Israel. Here's the next here's the next king, right? The next king can't be in a state of exile or banishment. You need to bring them together. It sounds as if Joab did not know this, though David did know it. Very well, I grant this. Joab carried out his scheme in part to help David realize that reconciliation with his son was both consistent with the law and in the nation's best interest. Thus he agreed to do this thing. Verse 21 says, without delay he ordered Joab to bring back the young man, Absalom. Now, it seems fairly evident from Joab's response to David. Notice what he says. Joab fell on his face there. Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight. That response to David, it seems evident from that he had frequently appealed to David for Absalom's return. Which likely was not difficult for David suspected that Joab was mixed up in the event somewhere. Joab risked both his position and honor in David's court, and perhaps even his own life in attempting to influence the king as he did. No doubt, relieved that his gamble had paid off, Joab fell on his face before David. David had granted his servant's request, but in the process, David had also satisfied his own yearnings. He did want his son back. He was glad that Absalom would come back. He would come back to the city, but we're going to find out here in just a moment that he's not going to be able to see the king's face. So what happens following this? What happens this? Verses 23 through 33. Note what the text says. So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. However, the king said, "Let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face." So Absalom turned to his own house and did not see the king's face. And then we have in verses 25 through 27 a little bit of a sidebar about Absalom. These 3 verses right here telling us about the man. And of course, the reason that the writer does this is so that it can help us to, it aids us in understanding what happens in chapters 15 through 18. Now, in all Israel, there was no one as handsome as Absalom, so highly praised from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. There was no defect in him. When he cut the hair of his head, and it was at the end of every year that he cut it, for it was heavy on him, so he cut it, he weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels by the king's weight. To Absalom there was born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar, for she was a woman of beautiful appearance. Now Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem and did not see the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. So he sent again for him to come to him, but he did not come. Therefore he said to his servant, "See, Joab's fields is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go set it on fire." Not a sane thought. But it certainly will get his attention, and it did. So Absalom's servant set the field on fire. Then Joab arose, came to Absalom at his house, and said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" Absalom answered Joab, "Because I sent for you, saying, 'Come here, that I may send you to the king,' to say, 'Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to still be there.' Now therefore, let me see the king's face. And if there is iniquity in me, let him put me to death." So when Joab came to the king and told him, he called for Absalom. Then he came to the king and prostrated himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So far, at least 6 consequences of David's sins against Bathsheba and Uriah have surfaced, as we're looking at the second section of chapter 14. So far, 6 of them. First, the child that Bathsheba bore died. Second, Amnon raped Tamar. Third, Absalom broke off communication with his brother Amnon. Fourth, Absalom murdered Amnon. Fifth, Absalom left the country and his family. And sixth, David had become an even more passive father. The family had become dysfunctional at this point. You see, when one writer says it this way: when David sowed to the flesh, he reaped what the flesh produced. Moreover, he reaped the consequences of his actions, even though he had confessed his sin and had been forgiven for it. Underline it, star it, mark it deeply on your conscience, or in your conscious mind. Confession and forgiveness in no way stops the harvest. He had sown, he was to reap. Forgiven he was, but the consequences continue. This is exactly the emphasis Paul has given the Galatians, even in this age of grace. It's referring to Galatians 6:7. We are not to be deceived, for God will not be mocked. What we sow, we will reap, and there are no exceptions. David was perceptive enough to finally see Joab's signature in the fictitious story. Question remains, will he be wise in the treatment of his fugitive son? Verses 23 and 24. So, the next step in the order of events, and it was not uncommon for people to be exiled for political reasons. Absalom was not officially exiled. He had fled because he murdered his half-brother. He's staying with his father-in-law. And he remained with his father-in-law for 3 years. Chapter 13, verse 38 tells us he remained there 3 years. With David's blessing, Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. He was permitted to return to his own house, verse 25 tells us, and possessions within the confines of the royal city of his own house. He was allowed the freedom there. He wasn't under house arrest. However, he was not permitted to see the face of the king on orders from his father. This suggests that though the death sentence had been lifted, still there was no intention of offering Absalom full pardon. Why did David refuse to see his son after permitting him to return to Jerusalem? I mean, why did he do this? Perhaps a major reason was David's desire to imitate the Lord's example in dealing with Cain. Though the Lord spared Cain's life, Cain went out from the face of the Lord, as Genesis 4:16 tells us. In other words, he left the presence of the Lord, so to speak. And apparently he was never again in the presence of the Lord. Genesis tells us that in 4:16. Since David had taken insight from this story of the first family, he'd taken insight from this to guide his judgment in this matter. It would be consistent for him to bar Absalom from his face as well. But of course, the situation from Genesis to here is not parallel on all the points, and it did not prove successful. David's method here did not prove successful at all. David's unwillingness to completely forgive and restore, that is, grant full pardon, Absalom bore bitter fruit in the heart of his son, naturally. And so his son, of course, requests or asks, why did you bring me here? I could have stayed there. Absalom's seclusion from the royal court undoubtedly meant that he had lost all claim or any claim to Israel's throne. By murdering his brother, his half-brother, he had effectively removed himself from the chain of royal succession, even as Cain had removed himself from the line of blessing through a similar act. Cain murdered, he left the presence of the Lord. Absalom murdered, left the presence of the Lord. Perhaps the suggestion is perhaps this was in David's mind. Just as God handled Cain, it's the way I handled Absalom. So verses 25 through 27, right in the middle of all this. Oh, by the way, sidebar, here's a little bit of information about Absalom. Why do we need to know this about Absalom? Because he's going to figure prominently very soon, and you need to know this about him. So now, verse 25, new information here. Though Absalom had fallen out of favor with God, he was a popular figure among other Israelites. The writer here wanted to provide a ground or a reason for what will happen in the latter three chapters 15 through 18. At this point, it seems out of place. It doesn't flow there. But there is a calculated method of our writer here. One reason for Absalom's popularity was his physical appearance. Hollywood certainly would have voted him most sexiest man in 982 BC. The text presents him as a flawless physical specimen. Israel had been susceptible to the tall, dark, and handsome blinders before. Remember Saul? Tall, dark, must be a leader, got to be him. Samuel did the same thing. First son that of Jesse's boys went to him, the firstborn, tallest. This must be him. God had to say no. So Israel has been susceptible to the tall, dark, and handsome blinders before. At this time in history, a good many people living would remember Saul. The description of Absalom's physical attractiveness is extraordinary. The idea is completeness, all inclusive, not another person among all the people of Israel who was as admired for his physical attractiveness as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no fault, there was no physical blemish on him. In fact, this description turns the attention away from characteristics of wisdom and piety in his life to more of the outward characteristics of the way he looks, things like that. And wisdom and piety, neither of those are credited to Absalom. But who noticed? And what has changed? Media and politics have operated on Absalom's approach for so long that we expect little else, right? Our times insist on style over substance, cosmetics over content, manner over matter. It hardly surprises us that a president who cultivates a public image of a warm, devoted family life would also, with his Secret Service agents, plod the tunnels under New York streets, flashlights in hand, on the way to a waiting sexual liaison in another hotel or apartment. Nor are we surprised to learn that this was a pattern from his first day in office. Quoting from Thomas Reeves, A Question of Character, A Life of John F. Kennedy. Nothing's changed, in other words. Nothing's changed. Regardless of the culture, the description was thematic as well. Previously, the writer has taught that people are not to look at an outward appearance. Instead, they are to imitate the Lord by looking at the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7. Absalom's physical appeal assured that those untrained in godliness would be beguiled by him, and many were. In doing so, however, they would blind themselves to the Lord's will. And the writer's emphasis on Absalom's appearance faintly warned of an impending tragedy, both for Absalom and those people who would follow him. His long hair symbolized his handsomeness. Absalom was evidently a hairy man, very hairy man. In fact, when Absalom would shave, and shave is from the Hebrew word that means to be bare or smooth or naked. It's not that he cut his hair, he shaved his head. That's the idea. He just didn't get a haircut. He cut it all off. Shaved his head. That's the idea. Shave, not shorten, is the meaning here. So, when he did shave the hair of his head, its weight was 200 shekels by the king's weight. The king's weight is of course, the weight that's recognized by royalty, by most of the people. Literally, it is the stone of the king. In other words, the standard for weights and measures at this point in history of Israel must have been set by David. And so that's why it says here, by the king's weight. 200 shekels is slightly more than 5 pounds. 5 pounds a year of hair. I have no idea. Is that a lot? Yes. I would think that that's a lot. Hair is pretty light. If you can cut, you have 5 pounds of hair, that's probably a lot of hair. So assuming a shekel weighs 11.5 grams, per 1 shekel. If this is 200 shekels, then slightly more than 5 pounds of hair a year. In ancient thinking, the hair represented masculinity, a sign of great manly power. And the writer's mention of Absalom's hair implicitly draws the readers to an unflattering parallel with who else? Who else was a hairy man? Esau. Esau was a hairy man. And like Esau, Absalom was a masculine, hairy son, just as Esau was of Jacob. It is also probable that the description of Absalom would have also called to mind the tragic story of Samson as well. The writer here criticizes Absalom subtly by clarifying the reason for his haircut, for his shaven head. He would cut his hair when it became too heavy for him. The law provided 2 primary reasons for a man to shave his head. One was to give the hair to God following the successful completion of a Nazirite vow, Numbers chapter 6. And the other was to enter into a state of ceremonial cleanliness before the Lord. That's in Leviticus 14, verses 8 and 9. But Absalom's stated motive for getting a haircut or getting his head shaved here was totally devoid of any connection with service to God at all. It was secular and self-serving. We wouldn't know that unless we studied the background, but the writer, including that, knows that those who read that would pick up on this. So he's giving a little bit of clue as to the shallowness of his character when he says this. He did it. It was self-serving. This detachment of Absalom's act from any religious motivation underscores the profane nature of the man's life and reinforces the suggestion that his life would end disastrously. Interestingly, his hair would play a significant role in his disastrous end. Do you remember how Absalom died? Riding on his donkey under a tree, his hair gets caught in a tree limb. His donkey keeps going, and he's dangling by his hair, which probably did not feel good. What Absalom proudly considers his finest attribute will prove to be the vehicle of his ultimate downfall. That's in chapter 18, verses 9 through 15. We'll get there. There's a genealogical note here as well. Absalom fathered 3 sons and a daughter. The names of the sons are not given. Why they are not given? In all probability, they had died in infancy, is the reason why the sons' names are not given. And this note plays an important role in helping us evaluate Absalom's life. Although 3 sons would have been considered a great blessing, by the time of Absalom's death, all of them would be dead, so that Absalom had no male heir to continue his family line. So we ask the question, was it in desperation that Absalom set up a monument for himself? Chapter 18, verse 18. The text says, "Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken up and set up for himself a pillar which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to preserve my name. So he named the pillar after his own name and called it Absalom's monument to this day." It's another indication as to why we probably think that the reason the sons were not named is because they had died when they were small, infancy or small boys. Possibly of sickness, probably of sickness of some sort.
There's a note in the MacArthur Bible that's interesting. It says there's a tomb there called Absalom's tomb, and Orthodox Jews routinely pass by it and spit on it. I've never seen something like that.
walk past it and spit on it. Well, did he erect this pillar to preserve his name? It sure appears as though he did. The Torah, or the law, declared that disobedience to the Lord would cause one's children to be cursed, Deuteronomy 28. And the writer's indication that Absalom lost all 3 male heirs so early in life would reinforce the notion that he was indeed under the Lord's curse because of what he did. Absalom chose the name Tamar for his beautiful daughter, obviously named after her aunt, Absalom's sister, who was raped by her half-brother Amnon. The sister resided with him in his residence. Chapter 13, verse 20 tells us. And while this act may have been viewed as thoughtful and affirming by many, and it sounds good as we read it in the text, it had the effect of perpetuating painful memories in David's household for a whole nother generation. Every time Absalom thought or spoke of his daughter's name, he created another opportunity to relive the whole tragic chain of events that resulted in a 5-year alienation from David. 3 years, remember, in his father-in-law's king of Geshur, and in 2 years in Jerusalem, but not able to see the king. So verses 28 through 30. Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem, did not see the king's face. He was restored to the capital, but he did not see his father's face. And when does all of this happen? This is probably around 982 to 980 BC. Solomon begins to reign in 971. That we're pretty sure of. 971 to 931, Solomon's 40-year reign. This is probably around the years 982. So we're looking at 10 years before David dies. David is an old man. He's in his late 50s, 60s, somewhere in there. For those times, yes. To live 80 years is a great, great blessing, according to Moses. So he's, by their standards, he's old. He is an old man. 10 years before he dies, in other words. This is about 10 years before he dies. His life, that is Absalom's life, in essence, was an internal exile. So he reached a state of mind that he was going to force a face-to-face with his dad. He summoned Joab twice, but neither time did he respond. And resolved he would find a way to get Joab's attention. So he ordered his servants to set fire to Joab's barley field. And it was successful, but it was potentially costly, of course. According to the law, Absalom would have to reimburse Joab for the lost harvest. I'm sure Joab didn't give that a whole lot of thought. Perhaps he had the means of doing it if he had to. However, he clearly regarded the potential cost to be worth the effort. So that's what he did. The last 3 verses, 31, 32, and 33, it worked. It did work. Joab did go to Absalom. Joab then went to David, made his appeal. During these years, he resented his father's treatment of him, that is, Absalom did. He regarded himself as a prisoner in Jerusalem. And you can see what he says to Joab. He was willing to suffer death for his murder of Amnon or to receive a true pardon, but the present compromise in Absalom's mind was unbearable. So this has to end. Either I can have greater freedoms to see my dad and everything else, or put me to death, whatever. But to be in the current condition that I'm in, I'm unwilling to stay there. So with all the humility of a lowly slave, David's son came into the king's presence and bowed down with his face to the ground. There's no reason that we should think at this point that it was disingenuous. However, David did not treat Absalom as a slave, but an equal. It says that the king kissed Absalom. And David's kiss here signaled a reconciliation to royal favor, but there's no reason here to assume that David's kiss conferred the right of succession on Absalom. And David showed no action that would indicate that. Neither did Absalom, really. So David had tried to punish Absalom by keeping him in exile, but not executing him. Then he allowed him to return to Jerusalem, but not to have fellowship with himself. Both of these compromises failed, and they only made the relationship worse. God's solution is to be merciful, to forgive, and welcome back warmly and quickly. That's the pattern that we see. And perhaps David was reluctant to pardon Absalom because his son did not repent. At least the text says nothing about Absalom repenting at all. Nevertheless, David's lack of true forgiveness bred a bitter attitude in Absalom that resulted in his organizing a coup to overthrow his father, which is what we have in chapter 15. Next week we'll look at the first 12 verses of chapter 15, and you see the very subtle things that Absalom begins to do to gain the favor of the populace. And just as we said in our lesson today, what's new? You read the first 6 verses of chapter 15, and then you'll see what's new. Nothing's new. He went out and he kissed babies and he made promises. Read it. Chapter 15, 1 through 6. He made promises to be, that if I were king, and you come to me, then I would grant your requests and I would act justly before you. He made a lot of promises. And it ended up winning people's hearts. And that helped him in his coup attempt against his father. You wonder where David was in all of this. Didn't he see this? Didn't he know? Didn't he realize what's going on? Or did he not think that Absalom would go this far and try something like that? We'll have to investigate next week and see. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.